Hey, Eagle fans, it's EaglefanKarl. It's going to be my quick check-in after that really frustrating loss last night against the Dallas Cowboys. So let's take a look at the good, the bad, and the ugly in this game. Starting off with the good, I really want to give a shout out to Carson Wentz, who I think had a fabulous game last night. His stats really didn't reflect a lot in terms of yardage, but his completion percentage was really good. His quarterback rating was decent. So if you look at the way he played the game, I think really he had a good game. And for my opinion, I think he was clearly the better quarterback on the field last night. I tweeted it out during the game, and I think it bears repeating that if you gave Carson Wentz the weapons that Dak Prescott had, that game would not even be close in terms of the way the two teams are performing. Carson Wentz clearly has inferior skill players around him compared to what Dak Prescott has. And even the offensive line, I think, for Dallas is better. But it seemed pretty clear to me last night that Carson Wentz was the better quarterback. And if you got to give him credit for how well he's played this season. I think his development has even come along in the last few weeks, now that they've had a little bit of struggles. And I've liked the way that he's continued to develop. And I think that bodes real well for us in the future, especially if we can finally get some playmakers around him. On the offensive side of the ball, I also want to do another shout out to Darren Sproles, who had a great game last night. Actually outgained Ezekiel Elliott on the ground in regulation. I'll take Doug Peterson at his word when he said that he was getting more touches than Ryan Matthews because of his production. It wasn't some sort of punishment to Ryan Matthews for his recent fumble trouble. But I think really, because if you look at the game, Darren Sproles clearly was really performing well last night. So you've got to give shout out to him, who running backs that are in their 30s usually do not perform at the level that he continues to perform at. And I think we often take him for granted, and he's a player that on offense and special teams can really make a difference, and he showed that again last night. The other good that I think we really have to look at is the defense. For the most part in that game, played real well. Obviously, sort of broke down in the late fourth quarter and in overtime, but our defense is not good enough to completely shut a team down. But especially with our cornerbacks, we are not good enough to shut down an offense that's as balanced as the Cowboys are. So I think really, when you look at how our defense played, I think our defense played very well for most of the game. I think for most of the game, they had Dak Prescott sort of very uncomfortable, and that showed, especially with the statistics early in the game. Unfortunately, I think we had used just about every trick in the book that we had up until we finally gave up the yardage in the fourth quarter in overtime. And it's just unfortunate that that's the way the game had to go down, because for the most part, I think the defense played a really good game. And I really just want to give out a shout out to Jordan Hicks, who I think is really turning into a phenomenal linebacker for us. And he showed it again last night. He's really settled into that middle linebacker role real well. And clearly, he and the defense confused Dak Prescott on that interception. Made a great play on the ball, and I think that was a turning point early in the game. That if the Eagles had won that game, that would probably be one of the turning points we'd really be looking at and saying that's probably where we sort of won the game. So kudos to Jordan Hicks as well for playing once again very well against the Dallas Cowboys. But when there is a loss, we've got to take a look at the bad as well. And as far as I'm concerned, public enemy number one for that loss was Doug Peterson, and the way his play calling, even throughout the game, but especially in the fourth quarter, really, I thought left something to be desired. First of all, throughout the game, he kept going to that sweep run that was not going anywhere. The Dallas Cowboy linebackers were playing with a lot of speed, and it was clear that that play was not going anywhere. But he continued to call that play, and it just really was sort of aggravating me. The plays that when they were running up the middle, were gaining yards. The ones to the outside were not. But for whatever reason, he continued to go to those plays, and it was really driving me nuts. But really, when it came down to it, the two plays that really sort of set me over the edge were in the fourth quarter. The first was with about 7 minutes left. There was a 3rd and 8 on the Dallas 30-yard line. So it would have been about a 49 to 50-yard field goal attempt. And they did a pass out in the flat to Darren Sproles. And Sean Lee, who once again was playing with a lot of speed last night, and he's healthy, he made a tackle for a 6-yard loss, so back to the Dallas 36, and then pushes the field goal attempt back to probably about a 56-yard attempt. They opt to not kick the field goal, and instead they decide to punt the ball back. Ultimately, I did not have a problem with the punt over the field goal. My problem was in the play call before that, because throwing that pass in that situation when Dallas was stopping that play all night, I think was only asking for disaster, which is exactly what happened. Clearly, if you are in a position where you throw a pass that falls incomplete, maybe it's a 10-yard pass down the field and it falls incomplete, you're still in 50-yard field goal range. You're going to probably try that. And the way Sturgis has been kicking lately, I like our chances in that situation. That would have put us up 10 and completely changed the dynamics for the last 7 minutes of that game, as opposed to Dallas getting the ball back and only being down one score. For that matter, I would have even been okay if they would have ran the ball there. If they would have just simply, handed the ball off, tried to pick up a few more yards to make the field goal that much easier, I would have been okay with that too, just to get it a little bit closer, maybe get it down to somewhere in the 45-yard field goal range. That would have been fine, even as far as I'm concerned. But this idea of trying this pass that was destined to lose yardage if they didn't end up making the correct blocks, and if Dallas didn't make a great play, which they did, it just was asking for trouble. And that was a play that was going nowhere all night, and I just have no idea why they decided they needed to go back to that. The other play that really drove me nuts was with about 2.5 minutes left, after Dallas had tied it up. We had gotten the ball, and we started out with a drive at the 25 after the touchback. And it started out with an 8-yard run by Sproles. So it's 2nd and 2 on our own 33. At that point, there's about 2.5 minutes left. We had all 3 of our timeouts, so there was no reason for us to really try and rush anything. We could have stuck with the running game, which was doing real well. Or we could have even tried to pass the ball down the field to try and take a shot to stretch things out a little bit. But once again, he went to one of those little dink-dunk passes that was behind the line of scrimmage and ended up going for a 2-yard loss. So now you go back to 3rd and 4. If at least you would have passed the ball downfield, even if it falls incomplete, once again, then you're at 3rd and 2, and maybe you have the option to run the ball there. At 3rd and 4, you're really not going to try and run the ball for the first down. You almost have to pass, and the defense knows that, and ultimately the 3rd down pass fell incomplete. So it really just was another situation where I think that Doug, I don't know, maybe if it was the fact that he's getting a little too conservative. Maybe it was an overreaction to the Lions game when everyone criticized him for having the play call that went deep that got intercepted. But where did the risk taker go that we saw in the first week, who was going for it on 4th downs and really trying to challenge his offense to do big things? That was not happening in this game. And I think he needs to sort of reevaluate how he's doing his play calling and selecting the plays in the situations that he's selecting them, because those passes were not working all night. And ultimately, whenever we had one of those passes that went for negative yards, it really ended up putting us in a bind. And ultimately, our team was not good enough to overcome those negative plays. And that brings me to the ugly, which is our wide receivers. And really, we just are really lacking in playmakers in our wide receiving core. And that much was clear last night. Some of the drops really ended up hurting us. I'm still wondering whatever happened to Zach Ertz. He just doesn't seem to be a factor anymore. Brent Selleck doesn't seem to be a factor. Tight ends are players that lots of times rookie quarterbacks can really rely on. And all of those guys just seem to have gone completely invisible of late. And the wide receiving core, I think, really deserves a big fat F for the way they played last night, because a lot of it has to do with the fact that they just don't have very much skill, and so we can only criticize them so much. And Jordan Matthews is probably the best one we've got, but he's not a number one wide receiver, and right now on our team, that's what he is. He's our top receiver. And that's not going to get it done. And if secondaries do not really respect your receiving core, they're going to continue to play up on them. They're not going to give them anything. So those little dink and dunk passes that do go beyond the line of scrimmage, they're not worried about them beating them long, so they're going to play up close to them, and there's no reason to worry about those underneath routes. So it really, I think, just goes to show that it's really become a problem that has to be addressed. I know it's a long shot that they do anything for the trade deadline. There was a lot of discussion, last week about making a play for Torrey Smith or Alshon Jeffrey. And while I'd love to see one of those kind of moves, it's probably not going to happen. And at this point, we're probably stuck with the receiving core that we have. The shame of it is, I hope this does not affect Carson Wentz's development in the long run. I hope that he can get through this year, and then maybe in the offseason, either through the draft or free agency, they can get a top flight receiver that's really going to be able to make a difference and be able to stretch the field so that we can take advantage of Carson Wentz's big arm so that he can go ahead and make some of those deep throws that he knows a wide receiver will be able to go up and catch. The other person we got to talk about is Nelson Aguilar because really it's gotten to the point where I think we have to start calling him a bust. He was a first round pick and he has not lived up to that. And the drops that he had last night really killed us. The one especially where it was down near the end zone, it was huge. And ultimately, those types of plays are what make you have to settle for field goals. And that was the difference in the game. If we would have gotten a couple more touchdowns instead of field goals in those situations, that game would have turned out very differently. And it's guys like Nelson Aguilar, and I know he was complaining about it, and I won't use the exact words he used, but he's tired of hearing about that stuff. Well, you'll stop hearing about that stuff when you actually go ahead and make some catches. And I think it really is a problem to have someone like him that's going to start to whine and complain because he hasn't shown that he can produce. If he were a guy that was going through a rough stretch that had big numbers in the past, it would be one thing. But he's never really showed any promise coming out of college like he was supposed to. And as a result, I think it really has set the team back because if you invest a number one pick in a wide receiver, you need a lot more than what Nelson Aguilar has given us. So for that reason, I think they really need to reevaluate what they're doing at the wide receiver position, and especially what they're doing with Nelson Aguilar. So those are my thoughts as to who I think is really to blame for this loss. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Who do you think is to blame for this one? And I'll go ahead and check in next week before the big game against the New York Giants. Until then, fly Eagles fly.